All right, so back to the phones before we had the drop by from Chip. We were talking to you on the phones about anything in rock. 844-686-5863. We got about 15 minutes left before I gotta end it and run right to the stage. So we'll continue, and we'll get Joe in New York City, who's been waiting a long time. Go ahead, Joe. You're on the air.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. First of all, really quick, it was great to hear how enthusiastic Bret Michaels was regarding Poison getting back together for something, just because I was going to call you when you were doing the band's most overrated, underrated, and it was going to be, for me, Poison, overrated and then underrated, because I went to that stadium tour here in New York, and Poison just blew everybody off the stage. They just blew my mind. I'm a drummer.
I got to tell you, Joe. When that stadium tour was out, we talked about it a lot on the air, and I stand behind it. No band got more positive push and converted. If it's possible to convert new fans after 40 years, or nobody did that. Poison was the band that by far, when the stadium tour was happening, I got the most calls about their positivity, how they sounded, the way Bret addressed and dealt with the audience, the fact that they played totally live. You could tell, I mean, everything about it. People raved about Poison, which I think coming off of that, it was a bit of a bummer to the Poison fans that they didn't run with that a little bit, but we knew that Bret wanted to go right into this Party Gras thing, and, you know, I had him on right after the stadium tour, and we talked about what I just said, and he said, I remember at that time, he said to me, 2025 for Poison, and I'm like, what, 2 years? He's like, yeah, I got other stuff I want to do. Now, he was teasing something with Poison a little while ago, so that might be on target for them to make some sort of announcement maybe in the middle of the year.
I'm very excited about that then. They were the shit, man. They won me over big time. So real quick, because you have to go on the stage soon, and I do have something I want to hear your take on. Recently, Kim Thale from Soundgarden guitarist, he was doing some talk interview, and he commented that the whole grunge Seattle thing and the grunge in general, pulling the gate down on what, you know, most of your listeners, as myself, you know, we were into metal, heavy metal, and then everything stopped with Nirvana, although Nirvana blew me away. Kim Thale, his passive argument was a lot of those bands, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, they didn't have enough money to afford cable TV or MTV, so according to him, they just didn't have the type of MTV exposure to follow in the footsteps of Aquanut hairspray and all the stuff that the videos were promoting, and he feels like that's why all these bands had this sort of raw garage sound thing going that exploded. And I'm going to stop with this, and I want to hear what you have to say, because then in '96 they were talking about something called the Telecommunications Act that Clinton signed, which consolidated all the whole radio station industry became consolidated, kind of like what happened with with bookstores, mom and pop bookstores and video clubs, with Blockbuster and Barnes and Noble and whatnot. And I'm wondering, did that affect you? Because according to that, when they were having that talk, they said the real end to metal and to rock was when the Telecommunications Act in '96 was signed by Clinton. DJs couldn't, independently. You had all these radio stations that could promote bands that they fell in love with, like Andy Summers swears that it was at one radio station and one DJ that put up the Police on the mark. And you are someone who's always been promoting bands. You said that you were the first one to play Metallica, or you fought to play it, or whatever. So what's your take on this? Tell me about the Telecommunications Act in '96, and did it have any effect on you and the whole payola thing, people putting cash money in envelopes so you can play stuff? I'm so curious your take on all of that.
Well, Joe, a lot there, and I'll do my best to answer as best I can with whatever time I have. And thank you, Joe, for the call. So I don't, again, for me in radio, now in my 41st year, I always operated counter to what was going on at whatever radio station I worked at. Meaning that I got into radio not because I wanted to be on the radio or be known or any of that. I had an interest in radio for one reason: to be able to share music that I loved with other people. My whole goal was, I was a rock nerd as a kid. Obviously, I still am. And I wanted to find ways to expose and share and play music for other people. So the first things I started doing was doing some writing in my high school newspaper, then working in a record store, selling and pushing the music that way, doing more writing, doing some early radio, later doing TV, later getting a job at a record label, actually signing the bands. So everything I did, and still a lot of what I still do, is about my love and passion and pushing the music out, whether it's older bands or newer bands that I connected with and that I like. So I was never, my point in saying that is that DJs having autonomy and all of that, that was a deal breaker for me. Because when I started in radio, like, I started and brought in out of high school an idea for doing something that was a hard rock metal show. And that was my way in. I didn't do what most people who are in radio or were trying to be in radio do, where you make demo tapes, you send them around, you're willing to go anywhere in the country, start working in the middle of the night just to try to build a career and play the playlist. I wasn't interested in that. So if I couldn't play what I wanted to play and do what I wanted to do, radio had zero interest for me. So that's why my gateway in was a concept more so than a great demo or a great radio voice or whatever. And so to that end, I always did my own thing. Again, there were times where I did the format because I had to, and it's how I made a living. But when I was doing predominantly music radio, it was always about doing my own show. And yes, consolidation was a huge thing. And if that happened in '96, I don't know the exact year that it did. But what that meant was, and I've talked about this a lot because it had a big impact on rock bands, or any music to be honest, is that prior to, if '96 was the year, radio stations across the country were all independently owned by someone. Whether it was a company or an individual, they were, for the most part, all owned locally by a local business. For instance, the station I started at back in 1983 was owned by a guy whose main business was developing photos. He had a photo development company. And we knew it because every other commercial on the radio station was for his photo developing thing. But, I remember it clearly. There was two gay guys that were partners, and they had this photo business, and they were partners as well in owning this radio station. There was a radio station in South Jersey that was that Matt Pinfield came out of working out of. Everybody knows Matt. And that was a little south, and that was run out of somebody's house. But it was a very important station because it was one of the first alternative stations. So all of these stations had ownership. The big market stations, they may have been owned by Westinghouse or whatever big conglomerate, but they all had this autonomy and this individualness. And that's why bands from the 70s especially will tell you, hey, we did really well in San Antonio, but we could never do well in New York. Well, why? Well, because then in San Antonio at that time, there was an influential radio station and an influential DJ by the name of Joe Anthony who would play these bands and take a chance on them and build a following. In New York, you might have a guy like Scott Muni who didn't like hard rock and didn't play those bands, and as a result, they had no following in New York. When consolidation happened, basically, as we stand today because of it, almost every radio station is owned by one of two companies. One is a company called iHeartMedia, which was previously known as Clear Channel, and the other is a company called Odyssey, which was previously known as CBS Radio. And yes, there are other ownership groups, but they own the vast majority of every radio station in America. And you basically have this effect of like a mother brain that controls all these stations. So what they're talking about with playlists is like, if you get added to the rock station in Dallas, then the consultant or the guy at the parent company will also could potentially go to the station they also own that's rock in Miami, in LA, in Denver, and say, we're adding this, put this record on the air. So the good part is if you're on the positive side of that ledger, where you're going to get added on a bunch of radio stations in one clip. If you're a band that's not on that side of the ledger, you're probably not going to get any airplay. So it had a huge effect on a lot of things. But for me personally, it didn't, because I was always on my own island doing my own thing. And, so it didn't impact me all that much. But it had a huge impact, for sure, on the way radio is added and works and the way radio influences rock airplay. Absolutely. Because again, you could have these pockets of the country where a band would do an arena and then they drive 2 hours and they'd be playing for maybe 300 people because the one market was all in the local radio on that band and the other market was not. Because they were all individually operating. And if basically everything's owned by one or two companies, obviously that individuality goes away. The other thing on this that's interesting too, when you bring up a topic like this, is that in Canada, I'm about halfway through Geddy Lee's book, and he talks about in the history of Rush, in Canada to this day, there is a Canadian content mandate, meaning that I think 25% of all programming on radio has to be Canadian. And in his book, he writes it out. It's spelled like maple, like MAPL. And the criteria, like, was the song written by a Canadian? Are there Canadian musicians on it? All of that sort of stuff. And that helped out a lot of Canadian bands because in Canada, they were so worried about British bands or American bands dominating the landscape and dominating what became popular there that they actually put a law in that radio had to play, and that law still exists as far as I know, 25% of what they deemed Canadian content and Canadian originated material. And Geddy was saying in the book that law came into effect at a perfect time for Rush because they were struggling to get on the radio, and then all of a sudden that helped push them over the edge a little bit because obviously they were a Canadian band. So they got a little benefit from that and a little pop from that as they were trying to get going and get started. I hope to finish the book off on my way back from this trip on Sunday. And then I go to LA on Monday, so that's a long flight. So by Tuesday of next week, I should have finished Geddy's book. And then I'm going to push out and try to really wrangle him to get him on the air with us. Again, they said he's going to do it. We just haven't nailed it down. We, of course, had Alex Lifeson from Rush on this show last week. If you missed that, it's now on the SiriusXM app, so go check it out.